Yeah, anybody who grew up in the 80s and 90s playing video games, they know where that's from. That's Sagat from Street Fighter 2. He was always annoying when I would play him. You know, he'd win almost all the time, and he'd be sitting there, he'd be like, man, he was a hard character. Anyway, welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. So I have to say bonjour to all my people in France. Merci beaucoup. Merci miss. Ça me fait plaisir de te voir. Appreciate you coming back and looking at my channel. And for all my people in the Philippines, Salamat, a King Magai Kaibagan, Kamusta. Kamusta for you guys. I appreciate you guys stopping by, subscribing. Speaking of subscribing, if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button for me. I'm on my way to 1,000 subscribers, and I have 510 as we speak. Once I get to 1,000, you just have more chess coming your way. So 1,000 subscribers equals more chess. So I appreciate it very much. Merci. And salamat to you guys. And at the end of the video, as always, I have the answer for the previous chess puzzle and a brand new one for you. So if you guys are ready, let's take a look and see what we have for this game. Okay, bam. So we got E4. Get that hooked up. We have E5, so knight to F3. We got knight to C6. We have bishop to B5, knight to F6. We have castles. So we have the Berlin defense on the board. As you guys know, Vladimir Kramnik played it against Garry Kasparov in their 2000 match. That's when it kind of grew in popularity. So we have knight takes E4. And as I always say, guys, this is not a pawn. This is not losing a pawn. It's very strategic. After you have D4, the knight has to move because you're going to be pinning it to the king if it doesn't move. So we have knight to D6. We have bishop takes C6. Pawn takes C6. We got pawn takes E5. So knight to F5. Queen to D8. We have king takes D8. And we have H3. And we have all pretty standard theory up to this point. The Berlin is actually notoriously drawn. It's a very drawn type of opening. So it's been drawn way more times than it's ever been won by either side. So this has all been seen, very many times before. So we have bishop to E7, knight to C3, all standard development. So knight comes to H4. And that's a pretty big sideline. That's not something that you generally see. But it's not too bad. So we got knight takes H4. We have bishop takes H4, of course. Bishop comes to E3. We have king to E8. Now, normally when you're swapping queens or you're keeping somebody's king in the middle of the board, it's usually a bad thing. But in this particular situation, it's still pretty even. It's not so bad of a situation for your king to actually be in the middle, because once queens do come off the board, the attacking chances for one side or the other goes down pretty drastically. So it's not as dangerous for you to have your king in the center. And of course, this rook always usually gets the ability to come out and participate with the rest of its comrades there. So we have knight to E2. All right, so we have H5 here. So rook A to D1. And so we have bishop to E7. We have F4. We got G6, and we have rook to D2, and rook to D2 is actually the novelty of the game here. So this is the first time that this has been seen. Of course, you don't probably always have these pawn moves coming out. Now we are in brand new territory. So we have H4, and H4 is just a very useful move. I'm not sure exactly where, but I'll post. I made a video kind of explaining and talking about pawns. This is kind of like a pawn freeze here. This is when one pawn freezes too. I'll mention it here, coming up a little bit later because we're going to have, similar structures on the queen side. We'll come back to that in a second. But we have knight to D4. Just trying to get the knight centralized a little bit. So we have A6. Knight comes back to B3. And so we have B6. And something else I'll talk about too is, pawns restricting knight's movements or even bishop's movements too. And this B6 move, not only does it kind of create, the ability for the bishop to come out, it also takes away these squares. Let me get this here. It also takes away these squares from the knight because the knight is wanting to kind of go somewhere else other than this B3 square. It's not a bad square, but it's definitely, a lot better, in the center of the board here. So we see knight back to d4. We have c5. So knight comes to c6. We have bishop to d7, and we have knight takes e7. King takes e7, and we have rook f to d1. Now, backing up here, after king takes e7, if you want to go ahead and stop the video real quick and see what Maxime Vachier-Lagrave actually kind of misses. It's not that it's super winning, but it is a very nice, very nice variation. It's a very nice move, just to kind of open himself up a little bit, and it's possible he might could push for a win in that. So, like I said, if you want to go ahead and pause the video real quick and see what move was a little bit better than rook f to d1. Take a second here. Bam. Okay, cool. So, for those of you that were looking at the white side and noticing that this bishop is kind of hemmed in a little bit by its pawns, the only liberating move is going to be f5. And it might seem like it gives away a pawn, and it actually kind of does, but it puts white in a very dominant position. So after you would have something like bishop takes f5, you would see the bishop coming to g5 with check, and then the king, is almost forced down. It's almost forced down to e6, and then after bishop to f6, you're attacking this rook, but unfortunately, you don't really have a good place to put it. You have this pawn that's attacked by the bishop, and you don't really want to too much move the rook anywhere over here because you're just going to be giving that pawn away. And you also are having to worry about stuff. Let's say, for example, you try to hold on to the pawn, you move rook to h7. You would see rook f to d1 now, and it would be a very big exclam simply because you're going to be moving rook here unimpeded, and then you have a checkmate situation here. So as you can see, the king is in a really bad box. You're going to have to move the bishop, here. That's really the only move to try to, redirect it to give your king some luft to move. So this was definitely a much stronger continuation had we seen it. But like I said, we do have rook f to d1. And so bishop comes to f5. That's multi-purposeful when the bishop comes to f5 because it is blocking. This pawn's ability to move now. So it looks like Wesley So recognized that that was a bad thing to allow. So he went ahead and covered that up. So we have king to f2. So we have a5. King to f3, and so we have a4, we have a3, and like I said before, I'm going to mention, basically we have a similar situation on both sides of the board. So black is actually dominating the position right now, and these pawns are very hard to be moved because of course you're not going to be able to push here because you'll take en passant. So I will put up in the upper right hand corner, I will put the video for the what I call pawn freeze, and I'll also put the video for en passant for anybody out there who's not familiar with those two chess terms. And keep on moving here. So we have rook to a5, and we have c4. So white's trying to do their own little pawn freeze here. We have rook back to a8. And so we have bishop to f2. And something I want you guys to notice too in this situation is the fact that black has a majority of their pawns on dark squares, and they have a light square bishop. And so if you trade that with white, pretty much, especially in the center here, white has their pawns on dark squares. These pawns are on dark squares. And so it's really hard for this bishop to have really any kind of scope. Compared to this bishop has really good movability. And even if you redirect it, kind of bring it back here and stuff like that, you see that the black bishop is far superior to the white bishop in this particular situation. So you have bishop back to e6. And so we have bishop to e3. And rook comes to h5. And so we see rook to c1 just defending that pawn. And we see rook to f5. So like I said, black is really putting, a nice little clamp on white's position. So it's definitely something that, it would have been nice to kind of see black, Wesley So kind of push this for a win here. So we see king to e2. So rook comes to g8. And we see c3. And then we see g5. Now, the unfortunate thing about g5, the move isn't losing, but it does liberate white quite a bit. Because you remember what I said a second ago as far as, the bishop not really having any scope. If we just run through some moves before I kind of go into an alternate variation, we see pawn takes g5, we see rook takes e5, king to f2, we see rook to e4, and we see king to f3, and then rook takes c4, rook takes c4, bishop takes c4. We see bishop to f4. So if we look at this position right here, we see that the bishop is now kind of, you know, gotten some scope. He's able to make some threats and stuff like that. And if we were to go and look at an alternate variation, after the move f6, it doesn't allow white to do that. So we would see pawn takes f6, and then after rook takes f6, white is still in a similar situation, and you might see something like, let's say, rook here. You know, white is in a similar situation as they were, you know, before, where their bishop doesn't have any scope. It can't make any type of threats in this position. So this was definitely a lot better, being able to shut down white's position. But like I said, we do have, where we at here? We do have bishop to f4. And so as you can see, white has kind of started to breathe a little bit more here. So we have rook to d8, and after rook takes d8, king takes d8, we see king to g4, bishop comes to d5, and we have to kind of give that pawn away. There's no way to defend it. And so we see king takes h4, bishop takes g2, king down to g3, bishop to f1, we see h4, bishop to e2, and bishop to e5. So we have c6, king to f4, king to e7, bishop to c7, and we see b5. So king comes to e5. We have king to f8, and so we have king to d6. Bishop to f3, and so we have king takes c5, and we have bishop to g7. We have pawn to h5, and we see bishop takes h5. We see king takes c6. We have bishop to e2, and we have bishop to e5 with check. And it is in this position that they actually agreed to a draw. Simply because, you know, like I said before, it's a situation with opposite colored bishops, and all basically. So let's say if we just run through another move or two, you know, the king will probably come down and attack this pawn. But then after the bishop nudges itself right here, as you can see, this bishop doesn't have any way to take any of these pawns. And this bishop doesn't have any way to take any of these pawns. And then all the bishop really has to do is just kind of rotate back and forth on this diagonal, and this pawn can never be captured by the black king. And so we are basically in passé. I believe that's a French term. We're in pass, or en prise, you know, same kind of situation, I think. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't really actually know that in French, but anyway, that is that game, and that is taken from round 1. So that's the first game they played today. And going to these chess puzzles here, we do have this one. And like I said before, this bishop is doing a really good job of defending this king. So we have to try to find a way to exploit that. And that is queen to h6, exclam. Because, you know, if you were to take here with the bishop, this rook would take, and there's just not a way to defend against checkmates. Because, you know, if we were to run through, you know, after bishop takes, the rook would take, and then we would have g5, and then after rook goes to h8, king comes to g7. We're exploiting the pin with this bishop, and we would see king to g6, and we would see bishop to d3 with check. And then the only move is to throw the knight or the queen in the way, and then or the bishop, and then that would just be all she wrote. You know, an alternate move, something else I looked at though as well, is to back up the queen here. This is actually like horribly winning still, but it does allow knight to h5. So if you thought of queen to h4, it was kind of an alternate move. It wasn't mating, but it was definitely an alternate move. So don't think that you got it wrong if you guessed that move. And this is the next one here for you guys. And it is I believe it's still an annihilation of defense one. So this is the hard one. So like I said, I appreciate you guys coming through. Merci beaucoup, salamat. To all my people out there, you know, go ahead and, like I said, subscribe, get me to my 1,000, please, and I will see you guys in the next video. I appreciate it.